Ma'am Rebecca Reichmann Tavares to kindly give her keynote address.
Good morning to everyone. Good morning. So thank you first to Somya for the introduction to all of us, and of course to Ms. Rita Sina. So it's really an honor to be with you, the former Secretary of the Department of Land Resources of the Government of India, and Dr. Naveen Kumar from Landesa, all of the presenters of the session. And in her absence, I want to also thank and recognize Dr. Govind Kalkar, who is a long-standing colleague of UN Women, previously UNIFEM, and now Landesa. I understand she won't be able to join us, but I'd like to recognize her important contributions to the topic of women and land rights in India. So I would really be remiss if I didn't thank Landesa for bringing UN Women here today. Landesa is a long-standing friend and partner of UN Women, and we really applaud the work that Landesa has already done and continues to do for the rights of rural women and tribal women. The India Land and Development Conference is an excellent platform that has brought together the government, academicians, and experts from the development sector to have a constructive dialogue around some of the most important issues crucial to India's growth story, the rights of rural women and their economic empowerment. I'm also very sorry I won't be able to participate during the entire 2 days because some of the sessions with really distinguished speakers are going to be very, very exciting. So I'll look forward to the proceedings of the conference. As UN Women, as most of you probably know, our starting point is to work within the global mandates and frameworks that recognize rural women's entitlement to land, water, credit, information, skills, and other resources. And our mandate is to work with governments to ensure that the treaty obligations that they have, to which they have committed, are fulfilled. And we support governments' capacities to do that. And we also support civil society organizations and through research organizations and institutes as well to feed into that process. And as you all know, and was mentioned in the opening plenary this morning, in 2015, all of the governments of the world agreed to the Sustainable Development Framework, the agenda to leave no one behind by 2030. And so UN Women works within the framework of the Sustainable Development Agenda to ensure women's rights and access to economic opportunities. The Agenda 2030 recognizes that economic equality and opportunities are the only way in which the Sustainable Development Agenda can be achieved. And as I'm sure you all know, the world will not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the agenda for inclusive development without India. So India is a very, very important player in all of the goals, and particularly in economic opportunity. So the principle of economic opportunity is championed by the United Nations and by all of the other multilateral organizations within these normative frameworks. And in addition to the Sustainable Development Agenda, we also include, as UN Women, the Beijing Platform for Action and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, both of which, India is a signatory to. Now, CEDAW, Article 14 on rural women, guides member states of the United Nations to first locally contextualize the national priorities around rural women and women farmers, and two, to strengthen the rights of women farmers to ensure equality. The CEDAW General Recommendation number 34 on the rights of rural women explicitly recognizes rural women's entitlements on food and nutrition through an integrated approach, ensuring that all member states respect, protect, and realize rural women's rights to access, control, and manage their own natural and productive resources, their rights to decent work and social protection, their rights to health care, and to have a stronger role in production, processing, distribution, market access, trade, and investment. So these are the aspirational goals of CEDAW, which was approved in 1979. We're all still working on achieving the goals of CEDAW and working with governments around the world to be able to ensure that policy frameworks and programs advance those goals. This year, just last month, at the 61st Commission on the Status of Women, which, by the way, I just discovered this, the Commission for the Status of Women, which is held every year at the UN headquarters in New York, is the second largest UN regular meeting in history each year, and it's only second to the General Assembly meeting. So the Commission for Status of Women has a great deal of importance within the UN, and the platform documents that are agreed by the end of these commissions are adopted by all of the member states, and they also serve as a framework for all of us to go forward in ensuring women's rights and access to opportunity. So this year, the UN member states committed to strengthen the normative and legal framework such as Beijing, CEDAW, and the SDG agenda by implementing economic and social policies for women's economic empowerment and establishing women's, and especially recognizing rural women's, collective voice, leadership, and decision-making. In addition, the recently launched UN high-level panel report on women's economic empowerment was released at the CSW this year. That panel was convened. This is a very high-level panel that the Secretary General of the UN convened, including heads of state, top corporate leaders, top academicians, and the member from India, Renana Jawala, is probably known to most of you as one of the founders and leads of CEDAW. She was an important part of the panel, and this was spanning all aspects of women's economic empowerment. But of course, the voice that Dr. Renana brought to the panel was focused on women's home-based work and informal work. So it was a very important perspective that was uniquely brought by India, I would say, to that panel. So that report was released at the CSW, and it has a number of recommendations to provide a roadmap for leaving no one behind and recognizing and supporting women in agriculture as essential for achieving sustainable development. There is no doubt, therefore, that here in India we have our work cut out for us. In India, 60% of all agricultural activity is carried out by women farmers, and that represents about 325 million women. Yet, only 9% of rural women own land. Half of them, and these are half of the rural women agricultural workers, are not paid. And of those who do earn from their agricultural activities, they make just 50 to 75% of men's wages. An ILO report on the status of women workers in agriculture indicates that over 80% of women farmers belong to scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, or other backward classes. So they are about among the very most marginalized women in the country today. And recognizing and understanding the multiple forms of exclusion that these rural women farmers who belong to other marginalized groups, looking at their needs specifically is really where we need to focus our efforts. The evidence shows that land title, and there's a great deal now of international work showing that land title does provide security and stability to women, that it protects them from marital violence, enhances their decision-making, and positively affects the labor market for women's wages. I should also note that having a land title can also ensure that women are recognized as economic actors in their own communities, and can also be an important factor in their participation in decision-making at the community level. The Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, released a report on the state of food and agriculture in 2011, which also finds that when women are granted land tenure, security, agricultural production, and food security also increase for those women and their families. Their data show that closing the gender gap in agriculture could increase yields on these women's farms by 20 to 30% and could in turn reduce the number of hungry people in the world by 12 to 17%. So this is global study. Now, we know that legal recognition of farmers in India comes from land ownership. But unfortunately, we understand that it limits and may limit their access to some kinds of government schemes and entitlements. And I would like to learn more about that from the rest of you during this panel today. But we know, as I've mentioned earlier, that legal recognition of agricultural farmers, women farmers, as workers shapes their social recognition and their participation at the community level, as well as in training programs and other public kinds of institutions at the local level. The national policy on farmers in India defines farmer in the broadest terms, including agricultural wage laborers, landowners, forest dwellers, salt pan workers, and more. But this definition, or these definitions, and the recognition of women as farmers has not yet been fully reflected in the implementation of the policies and programs for farmers. And this was noted by Dr. Hack this morning. That was one of the key messages that, we have good legal frameworks, but they're not being implemented to benefit women. On the one hand, land ownership becomes a qualifying criteria for women's access to certain kinds of resources entitlements, but yet it does deny them or may deny them their access to credit, training, and markets. So this exclusion does need to be challenged and better understood. The women's struggle must continue at multiple levels. And this is something that I'm sure many around the table, particularly in civil society as well as the United Nations, is advancing. And this struggle includes access to land through inheritance, including under customary laws, or through land reform, or through redistribution policies. Land and labor are so closely linked that increasing privatization and dispossession of land resources, women's work burden, and drudgery for even subsistence is increasing. In other words, women's access to land is actually being threatened more, although they should be, through the legal frameworks, they should be having better access. But this is the struggle that we need to confront. So I'd like to turn for a minute to unpaid work again, which is kind of a double burden, especially for rural women. The recent labor studies do reveal that more than 80% of women in India report that their time goes to domestic duties, including providing for water and energy needs of their families and their land. And women do almost 7 times of this type of domestic and unpaid work as men. The estimates reveal that the total value of time spent on this type of unpaid domestic work and care work by women in India would be equivalent to about 39% of the GDP. And of course, all this labor goes uncounted. I want to emphasize the amount of time and drudgery that's involved for rural women in, collecting water and fuel for cooking and for heating. Women's unpaid work burden, which is not only limited to care work for the family or domestic chores, is compounded, and this is, we're talking now around the world, but particularly in the global south, by climate-related uncertainties and disasters. Overall, environmental degradation, the increasing scarcity of water and fuel, and with urban migration, breakdowns in social protections for rural women. So this is a situation that is getting worse, even though we do have the potential of developing new forms of energy, and we are extending energy further and further into rural areas, and water is becoming more increasingly available. But because of the environmental disasters and uncertainties and migration, women's unpaid labor actually is increasing. So while women do most of the care work and the back-breaking work in agriculture, they're still not recognized as economic actors, as farmers, as workers. And UN Women recognizes that this is one of the highest priorities, I think, for rural women. And we continue to work with the central and state governments to meet India's global commitments under the Sustainable Development Agenda and CEDAW, but we understand that none of this agenda will move forward without the voice, choice, and security of rural women themselves. So we support civil society advocates for rural women's voice to be mainstreamed into all planning, policymaking, and budgeting for women's economic empowerment. We support women's movements to secure land rights for women, especially in the context of displaced communities and those who are affected by customary land laws. And I'm happy to share that UN Women, in partnership with the National Commission for Women and Mahila Kisan Adhikar Manch, which is the Makam network, we are working to strengthen the legal policy and programmatic frameworks for the rights of women farmers. We're reviewing through existing regulations and policy frameworks as well as through regional consultations with women farmers, their collectives, and relevant government stakeholders. So together with the National Commission for Women, UN Women is hosting a series of 5 regional consultations of women farmers through the Macom Network, which is really a network of women's coalitions around the country. And we're working also with MORD, which is supporting this process as well. So these consultations are now underway, and from the consultations, we plan to draw a roadmap together with Macam for policy and program interventions to secure the rights of women farmers. But we're just at the beginning of this journey. So much more remains to be done. We need comprehensive strategies that are based on the principles of justice, plurality of knowledge systems, and sustainability to ensure equal rights and opportunities for women farmers. I'm confident that through this conference, we will learn a great deal and be able to take that back to our work, and it will inform the future work of UN Women and guide our initiatives to secure the rights of rural women and women workers, and rural women workers. So thank you again for inviting UN Women to be with you today. As I mentioned, I think we have a lot to learn from one another. We as UN Women, although, we are doing quite a bit and focusing more and more in this area, I understand that we have a great deal to learn, particularly regarding customary laws and also the rights of women who do own property, and what the revisions in the legal frameworks need to be for women who do own property, so that it doesn't become a disincentive for women having access to other entitlements to which they should be qualified. So thank you, and I'll look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was a very illuminating keynote address and brought the world perspective for us on, and yet managed to focus